What if I told you that one of the most explosive documents in modern history was only 67 words long, and it was written because a country was terrified of going bankrupt? Britain didn't send an army to make this promise. It sent a letter. Before we go further, if this kind of hidden history genuinely interests you, hit that like button right now so more people stumble onto this. Subscribe if you want the next one delivered straight to you. And if you've got 5 seconds, share this with the one friend who always says history is boring. This isn't boring. This is the story of how debt shaped the modern Middle East. Let's rewind to 1914. Britain wasn't just a country back then. It was the financial engine of the entire planet. London was where money lived. If you were a government in Cairo, a merchant in Bombay, or a plantation owner in Argentina, and you needed a loan, London was where you went. The British pound wasn't just a currency, it was the currency, the measuring stick every other economy compared itself to. Britain ruled colonies, yes, but more than that, it ruled trust. It ruled the confidence that when you lent money into the British system, you'd get it back with interest. Then the war came, and everything that made Britain strong became the very thing that nearly destroyed it. Nobody thought it would last long. Soldiers were told they'd be home by Christmas. Instead, the war dragged into years, and it swallowed money at a pace nobody had ever seen. Britain's national debt, once a manageable slice of its economy, exploded more than tenfold in just a few years. Government spending on the war alone ate up over a quarter of the entire country's economic output year after year, with no end in sight. And here's the part most people miss. Britain wasn't just paying for its own soldiers, its own guns, its own ships. It was propping up nearly every ally it had. France was struggling. Russia was falling apart from the inside, its army deserting, its government crumbling toward revolution. Smaller allies like Belgium, Serbia, and Romania survived largely because British money kept flowing to them. Britain had turned itself into the bank for an entire coalition fighting a war that seemed to have no bottom. Taxes couldn't cover it. Selling off British-owned assets abroad couldn't cover it. There was only one place left with enough money to keep the whole operation running: the United States, and specifically the banking house of J.P. Morgan. This is where the story stops sounding like a war story and starts sounding like a financial thriller. J.P. Morgan effectively became Britain's money manager in America, arranging the purchase of enormous quantities of shells, grain, steel, and weapons, and organizing massive loans that pulled in some of the richest men in the United States. Britain was paying for these purchases first with gold, but as German submarines made shipping gold across the Atlantic incredibly risky, the payments shifted almost entirely to credit. Debt piled on top of debt. By early 1917, the overdraft Britain owed to Morgan alone had ballooned to a figure that would have seemed impossible just 3 years earlier. The bank had lent so much to Britain that if Britain went under, Morgan went under with it. And if Morgan collapsed, it could have dragged a huge chunk of the American financial system down too. Britain's survival and America's financial stability had quietly become tied together, whether Washington wanted that or not. Sitting in the White House, President Woodrow Wilson understood exactly what kind of power that gave him. America hadn't entered the war yet. Wilson wasn't interested in simply handing Britain a blank check. He wanted leverage, and leverage is exactly what he took. Late in 1916, his administration moved to choke off the flow of American investment into foreign war loans. It was a calculated, almost surgical strike at Britain's financial lifeline, timed right as major new British and French loans were being prepared. The message was unmistakable. America would decide the terms of this partnership, not London. The consequences hit hard and fast. Britain's overdraft with Morgan spiked to its highest point ever. France, already stretched to its absolute limit, had almost nothing left. Twice in the summer of 1917, Britain came within hours, not days, hours, of formally defaulting on its debts. Picture that for a second. The empire that ruled a quarter of the globe, the nation that had bankrolled wars for a century, was staring down financial collapse because an American president had decided to squeeze the tap. It was only after the United States formally entered the war in April 1917 that the pressure eased, as private loans were replaced by direct government-to-government funding. But the psychological damage and the desperation it created inside the British government had already done its work. Britain now understood in the most brutal terms possible that it could no longer take financial survival for granted. It needed allies, it needed money, it needed goodwill from anyone who could offer it, wherever in the world they happened to be. And that brings us to a letter dated November the 2nd, 1917, sent by British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to a private citizen named Lord Rothschild. In it, the British government declared its support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. 67 words. No army behind it, no legal ownership of the land it was talking about, just a promise made by a government that a few months earlier had nearly gone broke, addressed to a man whose surname was practically synonymous with international banking. Coincidence? Let's look closer, because the deeper you dig into 1917, the less this looks like an isolated act of goodwill, and the more it looks like a calculated move by a country trying to survive. Before we go deeper into how this letter actually came together behind closed doors, take a second and drop a comment with just the number 1917. It helps me see how many of you are actually following the story this closely, and honestly, it tells me whether deep dives like this one are worth making more of. If you're new here, now's a good time to subscribe, because what's coming next connects the dots in a way most documentaries never bother to. To understand why Britain reached for this particular lever, you have to go back decades before the war even started, to a French aristocrat named Edmund James de Rothschild. Long before anyone in the British cabinet was thinking strategically about Palestine, Edmund had already been pouring his personal fortune into the land for over 30 years. Starting in the early 1880s, following brutal waves of violence against Jewish communities in the Russian Empire, Edmund began buying land in Ottoman-controlled Palestine and funding agricultural settlements there. He financed the establishment of some of the earliest Jewish farming communities in the region, paid off their debts, supplied their equipment, dug their wells, and helped introduce new crops that transformed barren land into productive vineyards and orchards. Over his lifetime, he spent an enormous personal fortune, the equivalent of millions of pounds, and acquired well over 100,000 acres of land. By the time World War I began, there was already a functioning network of Jewish agricultural settlements in Palestine, built almost entirely on Rothschild money. This matters enormously because when the British government sat down in 1917 to consider making a formal declaration, they weren't imagining some abstract future project. They were looking at something that already existed, physically, on the ground, financed by one of the most powerful banking families in the world. So when Foreign Secretary Balfour needed someone to draft the language of the declaration, it's telling who he turned to. He asked Lord Rothschild and Zionist leader Chaim Weizmann to write the first draft themselves. Think about how unusual that is. The British government essentially asked the people receiving the promise to write the promise, and they addressed it to a name that carried enormous financial weight not just in London, but across the ocean in New York, where American Jewish financiers held real influence over exactly the kind of capital Britain was now desperate to secure. Documents from the period, including material preserved in the Rothschild family's own archive, confirm that British officials openly discussed the hope that supporting Zionism could translate into financial and political support from Jewish communities, particularly in the United States. This wasn't whispered in some smoke-filled back room as a dark secret. It was talked about, quite plainly, in the corridors of government. But the financial angle wasn't the only piece of the puzzle. By late 1917, Britain's entire war strategy was hanging by threads on multiple fronts at once. The Americans had joined the war, but hadn't yet sent enough troops to make a real difference on the battlefield. Meanwhile, Russia was collapsing into revolution, and the new Bolshevik leadership was openly talking about pulling out of the war entirely. If Russia dropped out, Germany could shift its entire Eastern Army to the Western Front, and Britain and France might not survive the resulting onslaught. A declaration supporting a Jewish homeland offered Britain a way to pull multiple levers at once. It could help build sympathy and support among Jewish communities in America, potentially strengthening the push for greater U.S. involvement. It could help keep Jewish soldiers fighting for Russia motivated at a moment when Bolshevik propaganda was promising an immediate end to the war. And strategically, it could help Britain build a friendly population near one of its most vital pieces of imperial infrastructure, the Suez Canal. Understand just how important that canal was. It had cut the journey from London to India, from months down to weeks. Nearly all of Britain's trade with Asia moved through it. The Royal Navy depended on it completely. Losing influence near the canal wasn't just inconvenient, it would have threatened the entire structure holding the British Empire together. A cooperative population settled along Palestine's coast, friendly to British interests, wasn't a nice bonus. It was viewed as a strategic necessity. Then there's a piece of this story that sounds almost too strange to be true, and yet it's very well documented. Chaim Weizmann, the same man helping draft the language of the Declaration, wasn't only a political leader, he was a brilliant chemist working at a university in Manchester. In 1915, he discovered a fermentation process capable of producing large quantities of acetone, a chemical Britain desperately needed to manufacture cordite, the explosive propellant used in nearly every shell and bullet the British military fired. Before Weizmann's discovery, Britain's acetone supply chain was in crisis. The usual source of raw material had dried up because of the war, and the alternative process required enormous, almost impractical quantities of timber. When Winston Churchill, then in charge of the Royal Navy, heard about Weizmann's breakthrough, he reportedly summoned him and asked bluntly whether he could produce the tens of thousands of tons Britain needed. Weizmann said yes and delivered, giving Britain the process free of charge. So picture the position Weizmann found himself in by 1917. He was the man who had helped solve one of Britain's most urgent wartime shortages, and simultaneously, he was the most influential Zionist voice with direct personal access to men like Balfour, Churchill, and Prime Minister Lloyd George. When Lloyd George was later asked what Britain gave Weizmann in return for his scientific contribution, his answer pointed directly at the Balfour Declaration. There's even a famous exchange where Balfour, trying to understand why Palestine specifically mattered so much, pointed out that Britain itself would be a fine homeland. Weizmann's response has echoed through history ever since. Britain is a fine place, but we had Jerusalem when London was still a swamp. None of this happened in isolation. And here's where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable, because Palestine wasn't promised only once. It was promised 3 separate times to 3 completely different groups within the span of about 2 years, and those promises directly contradicted one another. The first promise came through a series of letters exchanged between 1915 and 1916 between a British official in Egypt and Sharif Hussein, the leader of Mecca. In these letters, Britain offered support for Arab independence across a broad stretch of Ottoman territory in exchange for an Arab uprising against Ottoman rule. The exact borders of this promised independence were left deliberately vague, especially when it came to Palestine, and that vagueness wasn't accidental. It gave Britain room to maneuver later, room to claim things meant something different than what the other side understood. Sharif Hussein believed Palestine was included. Trusting that promise, he launched a revolt against Ottoman forces, sending his own sons into brutal desert warfare alongside British officers, including the man history remembers as Lawrence of Arabia. Thousands of Arab fighters died believing they were fighting their way toward independence. Internal British government documents from years later even admitted that Britain was, in fact, committed to including Palestine in that promise of Arab independence. And yet, when Arab leaders raised this commitment afterward, it was flatly denied by British officials, including Churchill himself, who reportedly claimed no such promise had ever been made. The second promise came through a secret agreement negotiated in May 1916 between British and French diplomats with Russian approval, carving up Ottoman territory into future zones of British and French control. This agreement placed Palestine under some vague form of international administration, deliberately undefined, and it directly contradicted what had just been promised to the Arabs. It stayed. French diplomats with Russian approval, carving up Ottoman territory into future zones of British and French control. This agreement placed Palestine under some vague form of international administration, deliberately undefined, and it directly contradicted what had just been promised to the Arabs. It stayed secret precisely because its authors knew it clashed with commitments already made elsewhere. And then, in November 1917, came the third promise, the Balfour Declaration, offering the very same land to the Zionist movement as a national home. 3 promises, 3 different peoples, 1 piece of land. And the people who had actually lived there for centuries, who made up the overwhelming majority of Palestine's population at the time, weren't named as a party to any of these agreements. In the Balfour Declaration itself, they were reduced to these agreements. In the Balfour Declaration itself, they were reduced to a single vague phrase, the existing non-Jewish communities. Not a nation, not a people with a name, just a demographic footnote in someone else's promise. We're a little over halfway through this story, and if you're still here, that tells me you actually want to understand this properly, not just skim headlines about it. So here's a different kind of ask. Instead of just liking this video, try commenting your honest reaction to the 3 broken promises we just covered. I read these, and it genuinely shapes what I dig into next. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this channel exists to pull apart exactly these kinds of tangled, half-told histories. Now, let's talk about what happened after the war ended, because the aftermath tells you just as much about Britain's real motivations as the declaration itself did. When the fighting finally stopped in November 1918, Britain's financial situation was almost unrecognizable compared to 1914. The national debt had exploded to a staggering level. Much of the overseas investment portfolio that had once made Britain the wealthiest nation on earth had been sold off to keep the motivations, as the declaration itself did. When the fighting finally stopped in November 1918, Britain's financial situation was almost unrecognizable compared to 1914. The national debt had exploded to a staggering level. Much of the overseas investment portfolio that had once made Britain the wealthiest nation on earth had been sold off to keep the war funded. Loans made to Russia were essentially worthless after the Bolshevik government refused to honor debts from the previous regime. And the United States, now firmly the dominant financial power, expected every dollar it had lent during the final stretch of the war to be repaid in full. Britain had entered the war as the world's chief creditor. It came out the other side as one of the world's biggest debtors. The center of global finance had shifted permanently across the Atlantic, from London to New York. And on top of all this financial strain, Britain now had to actually govern the territory it had promised away 3 separate times. In 1920, the League of Nations formally handed Britain the mandate over Palestine, tasking it with the impossible job of supporting Jewish immigration and settlement, while somehow also protecting the rights of the Arab population already living there. It was a contradiction baked into the very foundation of the mandate, administered by an empire that could barely afford to keep the lights on in its own capital. Over the next 3 decades, that contradiction played out through escalating unrest. Jewish immigration rose steadily through the 1920s, surged after the rise of Nazi Germany in the 1930s, and turned into a flood following the horrors of the Holocaust. Meanwhile, the Arab population watched their political voice go unheard, and their economic position steadily undermined by policies that favored the new arrivals. Protests turned into strikes. Strikes turned into armed uprising. And by the late 1930s, Britain was deploying tens of thousands of troops just to maintain control, using tactics including mass detentions and home demolitions. By the time World War II ended, Britain was in an even worse financial position than after the First War. Its empire was crumbling on every continent, and Palestine had become close to ungovernable, with Jewish paramilitary groups now attacking the very British forces whose presence had enabled their settlement in the first place. Britain was spending money it simply didn't have, trying to police a territory that was tearing itself apart over a promise made decades earlier in a moment of financial panic. In 1947, Britain finally handed the entire problem over to the newly formed United Nations and walked away. It wasn't a graceful exit. It was an admission that the whole project had failed. The following year, in May 1948, the State of Israel declared independence, and the man who became its first president was none other than Chaim Weizmann, the chemist whose acetone had once helped keep British guns firing, and whose quiet influence had helped shape the very declaration that started this entire chain of events. Now, it's worth pausing here to be careful, because it's easy to take a story like this and flatten it into something simpler and more sensational than it actually was. Some people reduce the whole thing to a single claim that Britain literally sold Palestine to the Rothschilds in exchange for cash to fund the war. That framing is too neat. It isn't accurate. There was no receipt, no deed of sale, no direct exchange of money for land. The Rothschild family itself wasn't a single unified voice. Some branches of the family actually opposed political Zionism and pushed back against the declaration before it was even issued. But it would be equally dishonest to pretend money played no role at all. The historical record is clear that British officials genuinely discussed and hoped for financial benefits tied to Jewish support during the war. The timing, arriving right at the peak of Britain's financial desperation, is simply too precise to dismiss as coincidence. And the broader pattern of British wartime diplomacy, promising contradictory things to whichever group could help it survive the next financial crisis, fits this moment perfectly. What we can say with real confidence is this: the Balfour Declaration wasn't the product of one single motive. It came from overlapping pressures, financial desperation, cold strategic calculation, genuine ideological sympathy from certain individuals, the personal scientific contribution of one remarkable chemist, the symbolic weight of the Rothschild name, and the urgent need to secure American and Russian support at the exact moment Britain's survival hung in the balance. No single explanation covers it completely, but leaving out the financial pressure, which most popular retellings quietly do, means telling this story without understanding what actually drove it. And that's really the deeper lesson buried inside all of this. It isn't simply that a powerful empire made a cynical banking deal. It's something more unsettling than that. When empires run out of money, when the debts pile up faster than they can be repaid and the creditors start closing in, they will promise almost anything to almost anyone. They will make commitments they know contradict each other. They will trade away lands and futures that were never theirs to give, with the same cold efficiency you'd expect from someone liquidating assets to escape bankruptcy. And the people who end up paying the price for those decisions are never the bankers, never the diplomats, never the officials sitting in comfortable rooms, drafting 67 words. It's the ordinary people who happen to be living on the land being traded away, generation after generation, long after the men who made the promises were gone. What makes this story so difficult to leave behind is that none of it stopped compounding. Every conflict since, every failed negotiation, every refugee camp, every disputed border, every headline you've ever seen from that region traces back in some form to a single moment in November 1917 when a financially exhausted empire, drowning in debt it could barely comprehend, chose to promise a piece of land it did not own to secure the support it needed to survive a war it could no longer afford to keep fighting. There's one final irony worth sitting with before we close this out. The Balfour Declaration was supposed to strengthen Britain's grip on the Middle East. Instead, It helped destroy it. Administering the mandate proved ruinously expensive. The conflict it triggered drained British resources and attention for 3 straight decades. And when Britain finally packed up and left in 1948, it didn't leave behind a strategic asset securing its empire. It left behind a war zone. The empire that tried to buy its own survival by promising away someone else's home ended up losing both the land and eventually the empire itself. 1917 wasn't just a year the war ground on. It was the year the old order quietly began to die. Not on a battlefield, but inside ledger books in London and New York, inside private letters between foreign secretaries and bankers, inside quiet rooms where exhausted men traded futures that were never truly theirs to trade. And whether we realize it or not, the world we live in today is still shaped by the choices made in those rooms. If you stayed with me all the way through this, that means something. Drop the word Jerusalem in the comments so I know exactly who made it to the end, and hit subscribe if you want more stories like this one, the kind that don't fit neatly into a textbook paragraph, but explain far more about the world than most textbooks ever will. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.